My name is Casey Hersch. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, author, and founder of LightYourSparkle.life. Today, I'm very happy to spend some time with Dr. Emeran Meyer. He has studied brain-body interactions for the last 40 years. He is the executive director of the G. Oppenheimer Center for Neurobiology of Stress and Resilience and the co-director of the Digestive Diseases Research Center at the University of California, Los Angeles. His research has been supported by the National Institutes of Health for the past 25 years, and he is considered a pioneer and world leader in the area of brain-gut microbiome interactions. Dr. Emeran Meyer has a new book coming out in June called The Gut-Immune Connection: How Understanding Why We're Sick Can Help Us Regain Our Health. If you pre-order the Gut-Immune Connection now, along with receiving the book, you also support Dr. Meyer's mission of bringing more knowledge and evidence-based research to patients and healthcare providers and offer hope for the future of gut-based disorders. For more information about Dr. Meyer's work or to pre-order, you can go to emeranmeyer.com. And just a little bit of history. So I live with chronic illness. I have Crohn's disease, and since I was age 1, I had just a lot of childhood illnesses, and I was prescribed literally hundreds of antibiotics. I also lived in a home with a lot of trauma. And when I turned 30, I was officially diagnosed with Crohn's disease, and I've spent the rest of my life trying to figure out ways through integrative models to slow the disease process and cope with it. And oddly, even though I'm a licensed clinical social worker, I was not familiar with the deep connection between the mind and the gut until I read your book, The Mind-Gut Connection. And when you said that the emotions play out in the theater of the gut, that has stuck with me ever since, and it's helped me see that the history of my childhood trauma and the way that I live in this sort of anxious state really is a critical piece to how to help heal my gut. And you became an inspiration for me to write my own book, and I am absolutely so excited that you've got another book coming out in June called The Gut-Immune Connection. And today the questions that I'm going to ask you are through the lens of what happens when autoimmunity is already present and when a disease such as Crohn's disease is already active in the body, and the consequences of trauma continue to fuel the fire in the belly, so to speak. So I'm going to start out by quoting something that you say in the Mind-Gut Connection, which I have right here. And you make a profound statement when you say that the gut cells in a chronically angry or anxious person using a script that dates back to childhood may play out dark plots day after day. Many gut cells in these people over time adapt to accommodate the stage direction. And you go on to say that the sensors in the gut become more sensitive and even the gut microbes become more aggressive. So can you talk more about this script that's created during childhood?
Yeah, so this basically, so first of all, I'm delighted to talk to you. The little information that you've given me about your own history is very reminiscent. I have see a lot of patients with a very same history, and um, can give you sort of an answer based on my clinical experience, but also on the research experience. So what happens early? So people have sort of coined this term, the first 1,000 days of life. That's so there's different developmental windows. The first 1,000 days of life are clearly essential for programming um, the gut microbiome and its interactions with us, what we call the host, with the cells in the gut. And these 1,000 days start really pre-delivery. They like a lot of things that the pregnant mom does, eats, thinks, feels angry about, will influence that development. And there's amazing mechanisms of how that. I mean, most of those studies in animals, so we can't say 100% if that happens in humans, but it's likely. Then we have another developmental window that really has been identified as first 18 to 24 years. It's sort of variable, and that's sort of when the brain fully develops. And the last part of the brain that develop is the prefrontal cortex, or the brain that um, you know makes us truly human and gives us a lot of power to control emotions or to um, interact with the world in a different way. So different developmental windows, and people have said, and I think that's very true, is that um, that there's sort of three things that happen in the development. So it's the G times E times D interaction. So one is the genes, E is the environment, and D is the developmental window. And so when you look back at your history, I don't know what happened between your parents before you were born. Was a lot of discord and fighting and negative emotions, um, which, believe it or not, would have potentially influenced, first of all, a lot of metabolites that are generated in the mom's gut that then, get to the infant. Then it's an amazing story, the delivery through the birth canal, and it's been shown by a colleague of mine um, that these negative emotions can actually, and stress can affect the composition of the vaginal microbiome. So when the infant goes through the birth canal, the first encounter it gets with microbes that sort of seed its own microbiome is already influenced by the mother's experience, by the mother's stress
Wow.
condition. And then, what happens in the first 18 years is often, I mean, this is what we assess with questionnaires, the adverse early um, um, life event assessment. And there's a range of things that started out when this first became a topic of interest. First started out with sexual abuse, and but that seems to be really, it's definitely not the most common one. There's a lot more subtle um, verbal abuse, rejection, conflict between the parents, there's a marital discord. The divorce itself or the death of a parent may not be as bad as the stress from the fighting between the parents. So all this essentially programs your brain-gut microbiome axis from the day you're conceived, I would say, all the way into early adulthood. And programming doesn't mean that this can't be altered. So but it's like when you build a house, you have a plan and you build this house according to plan. You can still renovate and remodel the house later, which we can do in which an adult can do. But these early traces may never go completely away, is my feeling.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the question that, we all have who are in these similar situations. First of all, making the connection that what you said is so profound for people who have these histories of trauma and then also end up developing these autoimmune conditions, especially in the gut. And so the question always becomes, how do we change that playbook of the brain and address the oftentimes unconscious script that drives these gut reactions? And is it really even possible based on, the information that you've studied and what you've just said?
Yeah, so you mentioned, a very important point of it. It's becoming conscious of becoming aware of this. So there's a lot of people that go through life that have these experiences that are not aware of it. What happens to them? They just accept this is my life, and they're physicians. Typically, one will not talk about early adverse life events. It's not part of the um, and so a lot of these things, this playbook unfolds, and is played out without the awareness of the patient, why their disease is so aggressive, why they needed several resections, as opposed to somebody else who has one episode and then goes into prolonged remission. And I should emphasize, it's not this mind, this playbook of the mind. It's not the only, as you know, as a patient, it's not the only factor in the complex pathophysiology of Crohn's disease. I mean, it's still incompletely understood what factors interact from diet to environmental toxins and chemicals, but it certainly plays an important modulatory role in my view. And so, we're actually doing studies, and I'm very happy that finally, the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation has, under pressure from their constituents, from their patients, realized that this is something that they need to investigate beyond just the genetics of IBS, of Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. And so these factors in the brain, this is how we started out, they exert their influence through the autonomic nervous system and through the HPA axis, regardless if you're conscious, aware of it or not. So a very important step to change it is to become aware of it. And so, for me, it's become a big mission to really help patients for all kinds of, social media and the books to create this awareness and this consciousness, because then they look at their disease in a very different way, and it becomes, they're then aspects of the disease that become manageable. They're not, it's not just being a passive victim of the next flare or the next recurrence. You actually can learn to identify these factors when they come into play. And I think that's really, this awareness is both in terms of the diet, which only recently has sort of come into focus. Again, thanks to the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation is now funding several studies on that topic, and on the awareness of these mind-based, emotional factors that we think have a really important role. And it's, you can always say, so people, when you talk about stress, people always think about the acute response of the gut to the stressor, and that's well studied. We know that there's increased contractions and increased secretion and slowing of gastric emptying. But it's a different thing if you have that traumatic experience early on, this programming, effect, because that really stays with you, for the rest of your life in some ways. And so any strategies that you can acquire to counteract this or mend some of the damage, that occurred, this is obviously extremely useful. Extremely important for patients.
Yeah, and I feel like that difference between having that early programming and then say, like, going through college, for example, and having a lot of stress as a college student that starts in your 20s, it feels very different for me, because when I describe living with Crohn's disease, I literally do feel as though my gut microbes are at war in a similar way that I experienced growing up in my home in childhood. And I often feel like intuitively when we talk about those gut feelings, is there a way to somehow communicate to my microbes that they are safe now? Because I'm perfectly safe in my environment now. And obviously, as a therapist, I've done a lot of work on trying to heal trauma, part of my professional training and also just part of my own self-development. But the feeling that I have if people were to ask me is like, yeah, my microbes don't understand that they're still safe and they feel like they're still back in that conflict. And how do I communicate to them that they're not in danger anymore? That's the feeling I have.
Yeah, obviously you can't talk to them like you would talk to another person. Once you understand this communication system that we have between our brain and these communication channels that go from the brain, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic and the HPA axis, once you understand that that's the main pathway, and that it's a bidirectional pathway, the brain sends down these signals and the microbes respond to them and change the interactions with the gut. This will generate this leads to, for example, a greater leakiness, permeability of the gut. If you're under a lot of stress, it will, sympathetic nervous system will directly affect the permeability of the gut to microbes that then, activate the gut-based immune system. But it can also be indirectly that the norepinephrine, for example, the main transmitter of the sympathetic nervous system, has been shown to affect certain microbes directly because they have receptors for our stress hormones. So they know exactly when we are stressed. And it's been shown now in many experiments in vitro, so in cell cultures, isolated cells, that this neurotransmitter, this stress mediator, changes the gene expression of many microbes and makes them more virulent. So they become more aggressive towards, the gut. We don't know exactly. There's probably other molecules as well from our communication system that can have the ability to crosstalk to the microbes and tell them. But it's been particularly well studied for norepinephrine. And it's also, for example, been studied that um, that the microbes can, so altered microbes can, let's say a different way, that you can alter the way that microbes interact with some of their food, like for example, the essential amino acid tryptophan. A very important pathway is to metabolize tryptophan into serotonin, which is stored in specialized cells in the gut. 95% of all the serotonin is there. That serotonin, in some ways, through the vagus nerve, also can talk to emotional centers within the brain. But there's also metabolites of tryptophan that microbes influence. One is a substance called kynurenine, which has been implicated as the bad guy. Serotonin is obviously the good guy.
Yeah.
And then there's a third one, the so-called indoles. So this is a group of chemicals that only the microbes can produce from tryptophan. So there's no way that we as the host can do that. And certain indoles like indoxyl sulfate has been identified now in many chronic diseases of the brain, but also the liver, to be some kind of a toxin, a substance that's bad for for our own cells. And so now imagine the nervous system, sympathetic system under stress has an influence on that system as well. So how many of these microbes are there that produce serotonin? How many produce the unhealthy metabolites? And there's obviously hundreds of these pathways, that are being unraveled. And so what you can do then to participate in this communication is you have to kind of train and get control over these sympathetic or these nerve pathways. And, there are several techniques that you're very familiar with, probably better than I am. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, hypnosis, cognitive behavioral therapy, self-management of stress reactivity. And all of this we know, or simplest one, abdominal breathing, diaphragmatic breathing. So we know that all of these are associated with a decrease in sympathetic tone and an increase in vagal tone. So you change the whole backdrop of this conversation to a more health-promoting, and it's not just psychological. I mean, this is translated into biology and into systems that have a direct influence on not just gut inflammation, but also immune activation throughout the body. So I would say, what somebody can do once you become aware, there's a connection between, the brain and responsiveness to conscious or unconscious stressors or perturbations, is to learn techniques and build them into your lifestyle. I mean, it doesn't help if you just do it for a couple of weeks or a month. You, as a patient who has this disease, it's almost you have to reprogram yourself. This is going to be my regular activity, just like running, exercise, or
Yeah, Dr. Meyer, you talk a lot about mind-based therapies in order to address the gut-brain connection, and it seems like in my field that is just so broad. So you mentioned a few minutes ago that there are some specific techniques that have been shown to be successful in reprogramming the mind gut. My experience is that cognitive behavioral therapy is not as effective if you're not working with someone who knows how to use it with regards to this gut brain connection. And that feels like a fairly specialized niche for me that a lot of my colleagues are not they're not aware of, because frankly they're not really even aware of this mind gut connection. So I'm wondering if you can pinpoint, when you talk about the mind-based techniques, any particular approaches that are more specific that people might be able to seek out. If they were going to do hypnosis, what type of hypnosis, or are there specialists who are doing this work that understand the gut brain connection?
Yeah, so this is definitely a problem, that there's few experts that are trained in these techniques. And general hypnosis, I don't know if there's evidence really for that works. But certainly, for example, we know in IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, there's several studies with gut-based hypnosis, and there's protocols, and there's now, people have created web-based versions of that. The same thing with cognitive behavioral therapy. There's now a movement, as you probably know, to move this to the web, to web-based strategies that are more gut targeted, and that everybody can access. So right now, even in Los Angeles, it's not that easy to find an expert, in gut based strategies. And but I mean, we've been working with one of these companies that will come out with a web-based CBT program. Others have shortened time course. So even with a 4-session cognitive behavioral strategy, it's possible. I would still say, I mean, the simplest things are the diaphragmatic breathing. That everybody can learn and can train somebody. Progressive muscle relaxation. So anything that you use your body or your mind to send signals into this system within the brain. So we talk about different networks within the brain that we want to target. So with these, with the cognitive behavioral therapy, you reprogram a system that's called the salience system in the brain, by which the brain constantly monitors both the external and the internal environment for potentially threats to its homeostasis, or its baseline, homeostatic state. And that system is pretty biased. So this is one of my explanations, what happens with early adverse life events. It's biased towards more expecting more negative events. And which in some ways in nature developed as an adaptive mechanism for animals, our earliest ancestors. If you grow up in an environment that's always threatening and potentially dangerous, you want to have a hyper-reactive stress system that assures survival. In our world, that no longer works. It becomes the opposite. It becomes counterproductive. So what you can do with cognitive behavioral therapy, particularly in the skilled person in this brain-gut interaction, you can identify what these negative biases are and work with them to eliminate them or attenuate them. So the brain no longer, falls into this default mode of the slightest perturbation is a threat, and I have to activate my sympathetic nervous system with all the negative consequences. So in simplest ways, I think that is you know, that's a good explanation, I think, for many patients also to understand. Some of these other techniques, like the relaxation techniques, they may not necessarily change that stress responsiveness or stress reactivity. They may just give you skills, for example, to attenuate the emotional arousal system or the autonomic, central autonomic nervous circuitry network. Um, and, you know, sometimes combining some of these, I mean, I always feel a good strategy is to start with the simplest one that everybody can do and see if that has a benefit and if the patients can do it on a regular basis. And then if that doesn't work, so then graduate up, you know, to the next level. And I also emphasize to many patients, sometimes it is required to use medications. If you, so it's not, so I'm not saying that you can overcome any trauma from the past simply with mind-based therapies. So there's clearly, you know, there's pharmacological therapy that if the anxiety is extremely high, to attenuate that component, plus the, you know, one of the other strategies, I find very helpful. So I mean, there's a lot of patients who don't need that, but um, you, I don't think the attitude of saying we're going to get completely rid of medications is a good one. And then there's obviously the diet. You know, the microbes um, have a word to say in this conversation, so to speak. And so the diet, in general, I would say, you know, a healthy diet is a diet that has anti-inflammatory effects on the gut and on the body. And a group of molecules, as you probably know, that has been identified as mediating these anti-inflammatory effects are the short-chain fatty acids. And they are produced exclusively from the breakdown, the metabolism by microbes of plant-based fiber. And the capacity of you, if you got microbiota, to do this transformation of, you know, plants into these anti-inflammatory molecules, you can train your microbes. So the more varied your diet is in these fiber-containing food elements, the greater the diversity of your gut microbiome, the better this ecosystem gets, and the more the short-chain fatty acids they produce. So that's kind of a simplistic way. So we have a mechanism in our gut that can attenuate inflammation. And there's now, you know, an increasing number of studies that such a diet, which is a largely plant-based diet, essentially. You know, not necessarily vegetarian or vegan, unless for religious reasons you want that, but it's largely plant-based. That has been shown to have these anti-inflammatory effects on the gut and beyond. And so now we have, you know, we have three things on the brain-gut microbiome interaction. We can dampen down some elements of these abnormal brain circuits with medication. So it could be like, you know, low-dose tricyclic antidepressants, which I commonly use without the antidepressant effect. It can be in some patients with severe anxiety, an SSRI, but then comes the diet, the anti-inflammatory diet, and then come the mind-based therapies. So you have always this triad of therapies, which I explain to the patient. I draw them the diagram, you know, the brain, the gut, and the microbes, point to where these therapies act, and that we currently believe that they have a synergistic effect.
Yeah.
And that hasn't really, like many of the things I'm telling you, have not been scientifically proven in double-blind, well-controlled studies on hundreds of thousands of patients. You know, but that is coming. For example, in psychiatry, this is coming, like doing studies with antidepressants plus, you know, a Mediterranean type diet. So there's some studies out already. that show positive results, and there will be more, I'm sure. But this concept, I think, applies to a disease like Crohn's disease as well.
Now, Dr. Meyer, so when you were talking about the diet, you mentioned a lot in your book about the animal, how you feel about high amounts of animal fat. And I'm curious is how you feel about animal products that say they're farm raised in their natural environments in countries such as like New Zealand. Does that change the way that you feel about the animal proteins in the diet?
Yeah, so there's obviously some kind of a culture war going on still about the increasing the predominantly plant-based diet versus on the extreme the keto diet, and keto diet
FODMAP.
defenders. And the keto diet defenders always emphasize, well, this is grass-fed beef, and it's healthy and it's higher omega-3 or omega-6 ratio. So the difference in this, the difference in opinion in these discussions are, is it the increased amount of fiber intake that comes with a diet that has very little red meat or no red meat in it, or is it the decreased intake of the animal fat, that comes with any meat-based or beef-based diet? So I can't tell you this 100%. For me personally, there's other, as I explained in my second book, there's other arguments that you could make for a largely plant-based diet, because it's also better for the environment and for climate change. I mean, there's a whole range of other arguments now that you can make, and I'm personally happy to see that I've heard lectures of some of the thought leaders in IBD that say a plant-based diet is actually beneficial, definitely for prevention, or decrease in the recurrence rate. But I couldn't tell you 100% if somebody lives on, for example, wild game that that eats natural grasses and plants, or beef that's raised in a natural way and doesn't have the hormones, doesn't have the unhealthy diet that these animals get,
Right.
doesn't have the severe stress that these animals go through. So it's not. So you still need some personal bias to say, I've made this transition. I used to be a meat eater, and I let science guide myself away from that, and am now totally convinced of the benefits of a largely plant-based diet. And in inflammatory bowel disease, it's not been so diet studies have not really been there's not, as there have not been many well-controlled diet studies until recently. And if anything, because we know an elemental diet can have benefits in patients that are in a flare to go into remission. So elemental diet means no fiber at all. But that doesn't mean that if you're not in a flare, if you eat a plant-based diet with lots of fiber, with the anti-inflammatory short-chain fatty acids, that would actually prevent the recurrence. And there's many studies going on now to look at that. I would be greatly surprised if, and I've heard this from patients. So, I always interview the patients that go into our research studies and try to find out what they have done to manage their symptoms. And many of them have gone to a plant-based diet. It's really interesting.
Yeah, Dr. Meyer, back to what you said, something about the vagus nerve. So in a lot of mind-body therapies, that claim to stimulate the vagus nerve, they talk about how, trauma changes the vagal tone. And then if you stimulate the vagus nerve, you can help the body stay in more of a parasympathetic state. And you mentioned in your book, I believe you talked about some form of electrical stimulation. of the vagus nerve. Are those studies still happening? So we really can't say, what that is about at this point, or does it kind of go back to what you said a little bit earlier, where when you're doing that deep abdominal breathing, essentially you are working with that vagus nerve in a way that is sending those messages back and forth, that bidirectional communication that is causing that relaxation.
I mean, you bring up an interesting point. There's been a lot of excitement about the anti-inflammatory vagal reflex. Many animal models, even the most severe inflammation, could be controlled or diminished through vagal stimulation. And there's been an institute that's been founded in New York focused on this approach. But surprisingly to me, it's not really developed into a established, broadly accepted therapy. There's now, again, studies going on, I think, in rheumatoid arthritis with some, preliminary results supporting the effectiveness. In our group, we've often talked about this, to try this with an electrical stimulator. There's always the issue, how practical is this? Can you do this with an external stimulator over your neck? Or does it require, like in the animals, an actual implanted stimulator, which, a lot of people would not want to have, even though it would be less invasive than cutting out part of your gut if you have Crohn's disease. And I am surprised why this has not been more accepted. In the meantime, however, I do believe that a big part of the benefits of this deep diaphragmatic breathing is that you force your vagus nerve to become more active.
Yeah.
So you send that signal from your diaphragm with sensory nerves into your brainstem, and you force it to change into decrease the sympathetic output and increase the parasympathetic vagal output. So I can't really answer that question. It's a puzzle to me, because the discussions and the earliest evidence of that vagal stimulation goes back 30, 40 years now. It's really, Geffen has been the pioneer, and I'm amazed that this has not really become particularly in, for example, in children with intractable Crohn's disease. Why there's not more studies to use something like that, even with the implantable devices?
I agree.
That could show a benefit.
Yeah, so I think that a lot of this too, like you're saying, there's still a lot of development, there's a lot of mystery, there's a lot of questions as to why. I mean, especially in my field, polyvagal theory is a big deal, and frankly, a lot of us weren't trained in polyvagal theory when we were in college in our clinical programs. I learned about it really after I read your book, and then I started diving into this a little bit more. And so there are some techniques that I've tried that focus on how to help the vagus nerve, which essentially loses tone from trauma and that direct relationship. But I guess the other piece that is a missing link for me is this whole idea of adrenal burnout. So when you have a lot of stress, we experience something called adrenal burnout, and it really seems difficult to calm the mind and body when the hormonal system is out of balance. So what can you say in terms of the role hormones play in the gut-brain connection, and is there a way to support the hormone system to affect people's guts?
Yeah, so this is a difficult question, and I may not be able to give you sort of a authoritative answer on this. I mean, when you talk about hormones, it could be, this would include estrogen and testosterone. It
progesterone.
Would also include obviously cortisol.
Thyroid.
And thyroid. I'm personally not an expert in this area. I have to admit. I mean, we all know that, that external cortisol or steroids are still one of the most effective therapies to decrease inflammation. And why the body is not able to mount that internal cortisol response to do the same thing as we do with the external steroids. Um,
Yeah.
I don't think we really understand that well,
Yeah.
and I mean, there's always, these patients that do well on steroids, then you taper the steroids, and then you come to a threshold and you can't stop the steroids. You're 10 milligrams a day, and is this the group of patients that have the least endogenous capacity to produce the sufficient amount of steroids to suppress the inflammation, or is that due to some other mechanism? I don't know. Um, I mean, the cortisol response is something it's difficult to study. So, for example, if you want to test this cortisol responsiveness, there's tests like the Trier test, very difficult to do in the laboratory, or somebody has to give a public speech and then is constantly being criticized by people in the room. So there's only a few labs that can do this well, and it's demanding on the patient. So we have not pursued that alley, quite honestly, and it is a shame because I would say, and the same thing for estrogens. This whole issue about sex-related differences, or this term now, sex is an important biological variable, has really not been studied sufficiently in most diseases and in most treatments. Are women responding differently than men, and what are the biological mechanisms, and what role does estrogen play in these sex differences? Most therapeutic trials have been, until recently, been performed in males. It's always easier. Most experimental studies are done in males because you don't have to control for the menstrual cycle. And if you do both males and females, the study costs twice as much because you have the sample size. So there's a lot of reasons why this has happened, but I think there remains a big gap in our understanding. How do women respond differently, like to any of these things that we talked about today, the early life stress and the first 1,000 days, and then the early programming. What are the sex differences, and are there windows of opportunity to treat women differently than men? And are some of these medications that we use, differentially effective?
And I think, Dr. Meyer, just what I know for myself personally, usually people who have inflammatory bowel disease, women, will describe, like during their menstrual cycles, that they are in a worsened flare and they'll have a lot more pain. Oddly enough, in my own personal life, I can predict that I will never be in a flare when I'm in my menstrual cycle. So there's something that happens. I don't feel the microbes as active. The inflammation is definitely down. So it's always, and I also know I experience a lot of adrenal burnout. I have to have based on my life. And so it's something that just continues to be in the back of my mind, that I follow the research, I follow your work, and I'm hoping that someday, there'll be some answers to these things. And I appreciate your candidness and honesty, because it's difficult as a patient to follow what's out there. And, you are so informed, and you're at this place where you're receiving all this information. And when you're trying to figure out what's real and what's not, especially with the internet, it's just comforting to have you say, right now, this is where we're at. So thank you for that.
Then there's a big problem, which I always mention. So we have some beautiful results and concepts based on results in animal models. You can really demonstrate in in a very homogeneous group of a small number of animals, you can demonstrate both in terms of the microbiome and inflammation, and knockout animals, genetically modified animals. So then people often make, particularly people that don't work in human disease, make this extrapolation, premature extrapolation to human relevance. And so this creates a lot of misinformation for the patients and false hopes. I would say it's very difficult to get convincing human results. They're much more expensive, take longer to generate, often are not as sexy as these, these animal experiments with triple knockouts and I mean, amazing science, Um, so this is definitely a problem. And one of the reasons that I feel, that my main passion now is in transmitting information in the social media and through books and through lectures to lay audiences is really to counteract or to provide the missing voice of science in this public discussion. Because I recently talked to my colleague, Dr. Chang, about this. It's that we generate in science, so we generate the results and the experiments and the knowledge, but we're not the voice to transmit this to the lay public.
Exactly.
And often the lay public is now completely influenced by the social media, and so it's almost like our voice has been taken away, and other people are doing it who are not, who are often more interested in selling their supplements than really providing the objective information. So I think that's, and there's several of my colleagues now who are on the same wavelengths in gastroenterology. So integrative gastroenterology, we call this, that, so we're all writing books and we all have social media, platforms. And so we all have the same mission.
Yes, that's great.
It's sort of exciting to do that,
Well, and on this note of supplements, I'm going to throw out some things to see if any of them stick. So a lot of people will focus on, say drinking bone broth, or supplementing with colostrum or butyrate, the short chain fatty acids. And then you have another population of people who will use medical cannabis to influence the cannabinoid receptors. So, and then of course there's the infamous FODMAP diet, where there's some conversations about if you eliminate the fermentable carbohydrates, then you cause the gut a little bit less distress. So of those things I threw out, do any of them stick in some way? What do you think?
Yeah, so the easiest for me to answer is the last one, so, and I should preface, I'm not a fan of the low FODMAP diet.
Okay, that's good to know.
For a couple of reasons. One is probably the one component that makes the biggest difference is lactose in a diet that you take out. I mean, we do know that 80% or more of Western populations, with the exception of Scandinavians and Inuits living in the extreme northern hemisphere, are deficient in lactase. It's a natural state. So yes, if you then provide a significant amount of lactose, it will cause bloating and GI symptoms. But the other parts, the complex carbohydrates that are being eliminated through the low FODMAP diet, is unhealthy, because they provide a lot of the beneficial, the food for the microbes. It's not good for your overall health in the long term, for cardiovascular health and other things. It decreases this anti-inflammatory effect that we've been talking about of a complex carbohydrate diet with lots of fiber. And it's also not sustainable because, a lot of patients don't want to stick with it. It's not. So I would dismiss that.
Well, and I think it does kind of go against what you were saying earlier. I mean, the microbes feed on a lot of these, like the plants. I mean, that's food for the microbes in like a healthy way. So all of a sudden, when you've eliminated an apple and a pear, and I mean, there's not a lot of fruit, for example, that is low FODMAP. There are certainly some, but then you do start, and then there of course is this whole other issue with people with these, bowel conditions, they oftentimes have some loss of blood, some internal bleeding. So they're often dealing with some anemia. We know nutrition supports the body in so many ways. So how does, deficiency in iron, how does that relate to the gut microbes and what's happening in the gut? That's just such a huge question. I feel like it's hard to find the answer to. Can you comment on that, Dr. Meyer?
The iron question, I don't think I have a good answer for you on that.
Mm-hmm.
But let's go to some of these other treatments that you mentioned, which are all interesting. So I've learned over the time of my career that you should always be open-minded, because some of the things that patients tell you, and they're still not accepted by the medical establishment, often are actually, later confirmed by science. So the leaky gut was one of those concepts. Patients came to me 15 years ago talking about a leaky gut, and I said, this is crazy, doesn't exist. They heard this from their functional medicine practitioners, and in the meantime, it's become a scientific term of increased gut permeability. So I'm always open-minded. There's another example, turmeric, for example. People have always said that turmeric and other spices have these health beneficial effects, and I've not taken that particularly serious, even though I love Indian food and use a lot of turmeric. But then studies came out that showed, that I think it was actually in mild Crohn's disease patients, that it had a therapeutic effect, and that it decreased the inflammation. And in the meantime, we know they interact, turmeric and the molecules interact with the microbes, and also, have a pathway that is beneficial. So many of these esoteric molecules that have been thrown around may actually exert their benefits through their influence on the microbial composition and on the metabolites. Now, with bone broth and with cannabinoid products, some people swear that this is very beneficial. I don't think there's enough evidence that I could make really an informed decision on that.
Mm-hmm.
I would say there's always a possibility of a placebo effect, and people shouldn't underestimate how amazing the placebo effect is. So I don't look at this as something negative, like
No.
the pharmaceutical industry. It's one of the most potent self-healing mechanisms that we have.
If it works, it works. I mean, that's pretty important.
So this is always hard to differentiate. What of these unusual, unconventional interventions work through a placebo effect. Cannabinoids is definitely, there's an anti-inflammatory, demonstrate anti-inflammatory effect on immune cells. CBD is more questionable because there's not that many convincing studies, well-controlled studies that it has the effects that people claim it has. Some people even say it doesn't act on the classical cannabinoid receptors. It acts through a different mechanism. But then there's examples. I have patients who swear that when they had a flare, that when they took cannabinoid oil, this was the best thing that helped.
Wow, yeah.
There was something else that you mentioned.
Colostrum.
Colostrum. Yeah, this is another one. It's quite interesting, and I would also guess this has to do with the interaction with the microbiome, that the beneficial effects are mediated. One thing to think about, so many interventions that plant-based or otherwise that have the involvement of large molecules, so like the polyphenols in plant-based food, or used to be called or still being called antioxidants. But these are very large molecules. Every plant has those in overabundance. And these large molecules cannot be absorbed by our small intestine. So they they go down into the end of the end of the small intestine, the ileum, and also into the colon. And then they require the microbes to break them down into smaller molecules, which are then absorbed, feed the microbes, are health promoting. So turmeric, the ingredients of turmeric, it's a similar molecule. It cannot be absorbed in the small intestine. It activates our taste receptors. That's why we use it as a spice. But its medicinal effect is mediated by the microbial metabolism. And there's probably many mechanisms. Um, I mean, starting with human breast milk, there's the human milk oligosaccharides, very large molecules, can't be absorbed, go down to the large intestine, are essential for building the microbiome of the infant. Same mechanism, that we have. So a lot of the things that we ingest or think have beneficial effects of supplements really involve the microbes as a essential element to generate the health promoting effects of them.
Yeah. Well, and I think the challenge is that when you have something like Crohn's disease and you then take in this whole idea of leaky gut, then also connected with that is this whole part about food sensitivity. So I think also we get wired to believe that we shouldn't eat certain foods because then we have food allergies. So we avoid dairy because dairy is supposed to cause more inflammation. And then we avoid, a lot of life is about avoiding and restricting. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that first, that each person has to find their own sort of combination of food that they feel they can sustain, but you can't get so restrictive that you end up being malnourished, but that you do need these plant-based high fiber. And a lot of people will say you shouldn't do a lot of fiber because that can cause blockages. I mean, it's just a really complicated world out there for someone who doesn't have the science background that you have, Dr. Meyer. So,
yeah, it's a very difficult situation for patients because we don't have the science yet to really say, okay, a plant-based diet is the best at a certain stage of Crohn's disease. It's not good. If you're in a full flare, I would not recommend it.
Right.
But if you're in remission, I've seen evidence that it is, it decreases the number of flares. And I've heard it from patients, and I've heard patients that said they had frequent flares when they switched to a plant-based diet. They haven't had one since then, over the last 2 or 3 years. But it's individual. I think I see a future where we have the evidence from the scientific clinical trials, which diet at which stage of the disease is beneficial. We may have, we may use stool analyses of metabolites and microbes to know individual differences in the microbiome of patients. Because that's also another, not everybody has the microbial ecosystem, for example, that can break down certain polyphenols and if you don't have that, then obviously it's not good for you because then you get bloated. And so this may be another thing in the future we will have as a part of the individualization. The third thing that you can do right now already is, start out with a largely plant-based diet and have the patient monitor their symptoms. If they feel that there's any particular item that increases their symptoms, then I usually suggest to stop the intake of that for 2 weeks, monitor the symptoms. If it makes consistently a difference during these 2 weeks, they should probably not go back on this food component or in a much smaller amount. And my prediction would be that this empowers the patient, that they feel they're actually in charge of designing their own treatment, so it decreases anxiety. I think one of the worst things about all these elimination things is they all increase anxiety.
You're so right. That is, I mean, absolutely. I've done a rotation diet, I don't know how many times, and I was probably at my maximum stress level at that point.
Yeah, no, so
Now, Dr. Meyer, what about like synthetic GABA? Are there any benefits to supplementing with GABA?
Yeah, I'm sure you asked this question because, there are studies, a couple of studies that have shown that in animals and in humans that, microbes can produce GABA. But we don't know if the GABA levels that arise in the gut from microbial metabolism, if they are high enough, once again, to the circulation and get through the blood-brain barrier, that they actually have sufficient concentrations, that decreases excitability of certain emotional circuits in the brain. I've not seen controlled studies on the supplementation. Same thing. So this was the other thing you mentioned earlier. Short chain fatty acids.
Yeah.
And you could do this by two ways. You could, ingest short chain fatty acids. I've not seen the studies on that. There's companies now that sell probiotics, a combination of probiotics that increase GABA production in the gut. There's discussions about actually genetically engineering microbes, probiotics to have increased GABA production. And I think all these are of interest, all these approaches, but so far, I think there was a study with GABA producing probiotics, which did not show benefits in inflammatory bowel disease. I'm not sure anymore, but I think there was a study that had pursued that avenue.
Okay.
I mean, the good thing is, like, all of a sudden, with this whole refocus on diet and the microbiome, there's a whole range of potential treatment options.
Yes.
And for patients, it's good news because
that's right.
It goes way beyond the traditional, biologic approaches with biologics and with steroids. These approaches would probably be non-toxic with very much fewer side effects, but we're just not there yet. I think.
Yeah. Dr. Meyer, I have a couple more questions. Do you have time for me, or do you need to? I want to be cognizant of your schedule.
No, we can finish this. Yeah.
Okay. So I had an interesting experience myself. I'm just going to throw out there. It's probably going to be new for you, but who knows? So there's something about the Frankenhauser ganglion, the paracervical ganglion. I have explored a lot of alternative and integrative approaches throughout my life, and there's a technique that addresses the Frankenhauser's ganglion. And when I did this approach for 4 days, I felt like I did not have Crohn's disease. And I am, a thinker. And I just have to figure out, I've done it several times. It hasn't stuck. I haven't, I'm going to continue to explore it because it's not going to harm me. It's worthwhile. I'm not advocating that everybody else goes out there and does it. But I'm just wondering, in the back of your mind, is there any research or anything that comes up around the Frankenhauser ganglion and its relationship to the microbes and the gut pain levels?
So I have to say, you caught me at a complete blank spot.
That's fine.
I do not know anything about, but I mean, there are. So there's another one of these alternative treatment approaches in Europe called neural therapy.
Yes, that's what I'm talking. It's something like that. Yes.
Yeah, and
yes,
I have interacted with people that practice this, and I have to say I'm open-minded to that.
Okay.
That you stimulate certain
yes.
ganglia that have to do with the modulating the autonomic nervous system, and I mean, obviously, any of these approaches I've seen, it looks scary. Some people have just long needles. They go all the way through.
Yeah, not as scary as it looks, but it looks scary. Not scary actually to have it done. Just, yeah, on the surface, yes.
So obviously, any intervention like that by automatically has a huge placebo effect. You know, anything that you do that is that that looks like a, you know, like a surgery or a massive intervention or something that you think this has to do something. You know, it's just so always has that possibility. But to really answer your question, I can't give you really an evidence-based answer on that. You know?
That's quite all right. I'm a thinker, and I'm also relatively jaded. Like, if I have that sort of negative outlook that comes from having trauma, where, you know, I'm probably more traumatized from having interventions not work. So my expectation is that they're not going to work. So when something works, like, I pay attention to that. That really catches me off guard. So I'm actually a lot more positive than I'm sounding, but it's just something that I'm paying attention to. The other question I have is in terms of fecal transplant. So I know that it's not, you know, FDA approved or okay for patients with, say, Crohn's and all of the bureaucracy around it. But I've often wondered someday if it's available to me as a Crohn's patient, might that somehow transfer the donor's emotions or personality or sense of self into the recipient's gut and therefore alter behavior or brain functioning?
Yeah, so this is a very good question. I mean, let me answer the first part first. As you know, the reason the FDA has not approved it because there's not been sufficient studies in patients with IBD or other diseases other than C. difficile colitis, that this is an effective therapy. There are some, there's some evidence from some studies that show some benefit in a small number of patients. The biggest problem is something that's called colonization resistance. So it's the fact that our gut microbes, even if they may be messed up in their composition and the ecosystem may not be as healthy, they're still resilient to any perturbations if you want to change it. The only reason that C. difficile works well is because the conventional ecosystem has been destroyed, by the antibiotics. And so we don't know if you weren't for this colonization resistance and you could actually transplant and seed a new gut microbiome, if that would be beneficial. We can't answer that. There are people working on breaking this resilience or resistance to an external influence. But it's kind of dangerous because the good thing about the resilience is that the gut microbiome doesn't change with each meal and with each antibiotic. If you weren't so stable and resilient to change, it would mess up our daily lives. But it's definitely something I think we should keep in mind for the future. And I think I shouldn't have said this before. There's one condition now, children with autism spectrum disorders, where a unique sequence of repeated transplants preceded by antibiotics was actually able to induce changes in the microbiome.
Wow.
It persisted for a 2-year period. So, I mean, there's clearly this will happen. We're not quite there yet. So then the second part of your question was, if you just remind me of that.
Well, then, like, if say the person did do the fecal transplant, is it possible that some of that emotional brain personality stuff might also be altering for the recipient?
Yeah, this is a very good question, because we know now that if you transplant fecal material from patients with major depressive disorders into mouse models or rat models, it will change their emotional behavior. So we know this from humans to mouse. The problem is, these mice have to be germ-free, so they don't have their own, gut microbiome. So the only thing that they're getting now is these donor microbes. And so far as I'm concerned, I've not heard. I've asked that question many times at meetings if anybody has observed this as a side effect. There was one case where I think somebody got a transplant from an obese patient and then dramatically gained weight after that. But that has these transplants and the donors have been so well controlled now that that do not allow patients that even have a history of psychiatric disease or have their own psychiatric symptoms would be allowed to be a donor. It can be very common because in the early phases of these transplants, and even a lot of people do it to themselves. I mean, if you go to the internet, there's all these instructions of
Yes.
fecal transplant, and so I've just not heard that, as either from patients or seen it in the literature that people all of a sudden became depressed, which makes it a little bit. Well, I mean, it doesn't really make me too concerned because, as I said earlier, it works in animal models because you first get rid of all the animal's own bacteria, which you never would do in
Right.
an object, so.
Yeah. Yeah, because I've often thought, I mean, I want to change my microbiome because it's got a lot of problems, but I want to keep my brain, the type of brain that I have, because my brain's really good. And I know I'm overly emotional, but I kind of I like that part of myself. I just need to modulate the anxious side. So it's just has been something I've pondered a lot. So thank you for answering that question. If you had to mention, like, how much in people with trauma do you just personally believe that the fight or flight stress response is part of the inflammation, that autoimmune inflammatory response that's going a lot of the time? How much, if you get rid of that fight or flight response, do you believe that would cut down on a substantial amount of inflammation that they have in their bodies?
Yeah, I would say that's what I would expect. If you decrease this massive sympathetic outflow to the body and to the gut, that would have a beneficial effect on inflammation, on leakiness, on systemic immune activation. Sort of peripheral to this question, but that always comes to mind for me when you see the immense trauma that so many people in the world, all these refugees. I mean, just thinking about, what happens at the U.S. border. These kids, thousands of these kids undergo this. Based on our science and our studies, you would almost predict that most of them will develop major psychiatric problems, but they probably won't. So this is a big question. What is the resilience? What is this, a genetic resilience? Is this that they grew up in tight-knit families, Latin families that have trained a bigger resilience of the stress system than? But this is amazing to me. Like you would think when you see all these images from refugees around the world and from traumatized people in Syria. Just last night I saw this, that the Syrians bombed hospitals and schools, and these kids sitting in the classroom, always a worry that there's going to be another attack. You would think that all of them will have mental disorders, but I don't think that's the case. And many of these refugees, if they make it to Europe or to the US, some of them do extremely well, career-wise, and so. Yeah, there's something there's a lot of things we don't know. It's so this resilience factor. A few years ago we renamed our center from neurobiology of stress to neurobiology of stress and resilience because we wanted to incorporate this. And when we looked at some of the studies about the effect of early life trauma on, for example, on IBS prevalence, resilience was a factor that decreased the number of patients. So those that had high resilience and the same trauma had fewer IBS symptoms than those did not. So that's definitely something. And I would say resilience applies both to our gut, to the diversity of the gut microbiome, which is obviously compromised in the US and in most Western countries. And I think it probably also applies to our brain because we don't have the same kind of family structure and early supportive environments, for a lot of people that the more traditional societies have.
Yeah, very true. And I appreciate that mentioning of resiliency because I'm in my 40s, and despite the type of childhood trauma that I had, which was more emotional, and the literally hundreds of antibiotics that could not have helped my gut microbiome, just the volumes just too great. And then the stress that prenatal, pre-life in the womb, so to speak, where my mom was carrying me, and I'm sure she was dealing with a lot of nervousness. My mom always had a nervous stomach. So I put all these pieces together, of course, while I was reading your first book, The Mind-Gut Connection, and I'm tracking myself as a case study, which then I wrote my own book about. But in that, what I know about myself is this resiliency piece, because I had these buffers. Now, I haven't had any surgeries. I still have all my organs intact. The surgery that I did have was a medical mishap where my iliac vein was nicked during a laparoscopy. So that was the only surgery that I've had. But I had piano as a little girl, music, and then my mom was a really big fan of singing, reading, and talking. So, I know that singing stimulates the vagus nerve. You get that little vibration. I sang a lot, just like weird songs to help me cope with life. And I played outdoors because we lived in the mountains. And as an adult, I ballroom dance. And if I had to say the single most therapeutic intervention that I have done for Crohn's disease in my entire life, I would have to say it was when I started ballroom dancing. There was just something about the mind-body connection and the music and the relationship with the dance partner that in that space on the dance floor, doing that part that I love, which of course part of it is passion, there is no room for Crohn's disease.
This is really amazing. Just think about this. So many of these traditional cultures and countries, music plays a very big element, no matter if it's the Middle East or South America. I mean, in South America, I know that from personal experience, it's half of their lifestyle, the music. And I just wonder, if that has a resilience building effect. I mean, it's an amazing thought. We'll probably never know the answer, but I would not be surprised, like from what you say.
Neither would I. And a lot of these cultures that you're mentioning too, there is always a form of movement and dance as well. So there's music, there's movement, there's dancing. And, we're naturally designed to move and to let go of the traumas that get trapped in the bodies through movement. So I also know there's that, right brain, left brain connection, the relationship piece, and how important feeling seen and heard and understood, and that social engagement, what that does to decrease our sense of fear. So, in that sense, when you're dancing and you're having this relationship with someone that involves touch, movement, music, mind, body, you're feeling things, you're more grounded to the earth. I mean, there's all these different elements. I think, we often don't pay attention to the assets and strengths that we have in our lives that bring us to the place where we are. And we're talking about those families where there's just such severe trauma, way more trauma than I could ever imagine these children are going through. And many of them will not come out, in their 30s with inflammatory bowel disease. So, yeah. Well, Dr. Meyer, there's one last thing. In your book, The Mind-Gut Connection, you make a statement that if more doctors and patients realize that the gut is in fact a theater in which the drama of emotions play out, the drama might be less likely to become a painful melodrama. Yet amazingly, the majority of patients suffering from abnormal gut reactions have no idea that their gut problems reflect their emotional state. And even more amazingly, most of the time, neither do their doctors. And I feel like this goes full circle back to the way we started with this need for education. And what suggestions would you make to enhance the medical school curriculum, number one? And number two, how can patients be sure that they incorporate this mind gut connection in their treatment without compromising the relationship they have with their healthcare provider who might not be aware of it?
Yeah, so I would say, I mean, this is a definitely a challenge because we're not going to change, the medical school curriculum overnight, and with the way modern medicine is practiced, much less time physician-patient interactions um, than it used to be in the past. I mean, I feel like when I see patients, I'm doing it like a dinosaur because I still do it the way I was trained,
Oh,
in my
nice.
fellowship. And but then when I go to my own practitioner for a checkup, I'm always amazed, how little conversation there is. There's a 5-minute conversation and then blood tests, and that's it. So that's the bad side. The good side is that there are now movements, and good example is our division at UCLA that has created these wellness programs or integrative medicine um, at university hospitals is definitely something that has increased significantly. And so I think gradually there will be physicians will be trained in being more aware and also having a set of tools that they can use or recommend, and it's accepted by the rest of the university medical enterprise. So I look at this relatively positively
Yeah.
for the future. For the moment, I think there will be many experiences that patients have. They might have read my book or somebody else's book along the same lines, and they go to their traditional physician and they say, "Don't believe this stuff." It's um, Crohn's disease is can be explained by immune cell by a T cell receptor, and we don't need any of this other stuff. So that will persist for a while. I think I see that happening definitely now, but yeah, it's been really encouraging to see how many people are going this direction of integrative medicine. Um, and as you know, there's sort of two sides to it. There's the whole functional medicine enthusiasm. I'm a little bit skeptical. I like some of the concepts that these people in that specialty propose, like a more holistic view of the body and the mind. But many of the concrete recommendations are just not supported by evidence. Integrative medicine is different. So there's clearly those that come out of um, well-established, respected integrative medicine programs like the University of Arizona, uh, Andy Weil's program, or like in our case now at UCLA, the UCLA Wellness Program. Um, that's a different story. I think those are people that are trained in both the conventional medicine, the scientifically based, but also they have a much more open viewpoint and acceptance of other aspects of it. And yeah, yeah, and I mentioned it earlier. These 3 other people that I've kind of affiliated with, that we call ourselves integrative gastroenterologists. That would be great if that happens in other specialties as well. So
Yes.
it's almost like a subgroup of people that are credible. Whatever they say is not sort of some fad that functional medicine people would promote. Um, but they would really understand the patient, on their. I mean, there's a big discrepancy I see even with Crohn's patients. years ago, when I was asked by the Crohn's Foundation to talk to patient groups, and I would always ask the question: how many people in the audience think that stress and negative emotions play a role in the frequency of your symptoms, your flares, the severity? And all the hands went up, and then when I talked to my colleagues, the IBD experts in our division, they would totally reject it. They said, this
Wow.
is nothing, stress has nothing to do with it. It's so, this is really, for years this went on. Now, the CCF has changed their viewpoint and very open and accepting to a different viewpoint on this, which is great. Yeah, so.
Well, and I think part of it too is even in the medical community, there's some responsibility, but there's also a huge responsibility in the mental health community. So we've got the medical schools, that we've got the clinical psychology and social work programs where I didn't know about the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experience scores, in my clinical program. So here I am, I'm reading your book. At this point, all of this information is sort of coming at me in this synergistic way, which was amazing. I take the ACEs quiz, which should have, in my opinion, just been the first thing I took on my first day of grad school. And, I have 8 out of 10 of the ACEs. And then I start reading, okay, statistically, if you've got a certain number of ACEs, you're more likely to have health problems as an adult. And I start going through the list. And so, these are, it's so eye-opening, and it's also validating, because I think those of us who have these chronic conditions, especially involving the gut, we know that when there's stress, there is a worsening. The holidays are worse, when you've got exams, whatever it is, wherever you're at in your life. And it's not just bad stress. It's sometimes when you're super excited. I mean, I was so excited to have this interview with you, but I will have to say that yesterday my stomach was a little more stirred up than usual, because good anxiety also, affects the gut. So there is just a huge disconnect. But once I feel that I was very empowered when your book came out, in that I could go to my physician, because you're a credible physician yourself, and also doing all this work at UCLA. And there's something about that. And when they, when I fired physicians because they said, doesn't matter, eat cheese and drink beer and do whatever you want, I was like, no way, I would never do that. I think that would put me in the hospital. I was able to then counter and say, look, you know what? I have this book here, and I would say, go look up Dr. Emeran Meier, UCLA, look at the work he's doing, look at the center that he's working with stress and resilience. This is real. There's something about this gut-brain connection. So I feel like, patients, because of your work, can also be empowered to also educate their physician. And, that puts us back in the driver's seat of our own health too, when we feel like we're part of our treatment and we have a say in what's going on.
It's really great to hear from me, to hear this from you, because I've not really spent enough time, I think,
I could tell you stories all day, Dr. Meier.
Yeah, no, but I haven't spent enough time to talk to the IBD community. I've always been invited to be on this special Facebook group on IBD. Even I've been invited several times, but I'm actually thinking, believe it or not, this next book is not out yet, of the third book, which would be the gut disease connection, and which would focus basically on IBD and on IBS, and sort of apply, the same thinking, many things we talked about, specifically to IBD.
Yeah.
Which I think there's a big audience, I think it's.
And I do think that there's those of us with inflammatory bowel disease, I don't speak for everybody, but there's a sense that there is a component of this irritable bowel that is a part of the inflammatory bowel disease.
Yeah.
So if one could address the IBS, so to speak, then that would alleviate a lot of symptoms, because with the irritable bowel, you would be addressing perhaps the fight or flight response, that stress response, the stuff that triggers a nervous stomach. But then there's this whole other level of inflammation that I believe, especially if you've got adverse childhood experiences, you have an unconscious response going on in your system that's assessing the environment as dangerous, that's keeping your body in this activated state that you feel like you can't control. And
Yeah.
then you've also got this other level of disease that can be quite debilitating. So I feel like, in some ways we need to have a voice that is our own, because, and that's why I said at the beginning, I really want to talk about this from the lens of someone who really has this chronic disease state already active, because, we feel sometimes like there's not enough information for us, and we're a little bit more sick, it seems like, in some ways than having the irritable bowel.
Oh, no,
But yet in
absolutely.
some ways we're so similar that
Yeah.
you can't separate the two entirely.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so you have to wait a couple more years and
Okay.
can talk about the next book.
Well, I'm grateful that you're doing this work. I'm deeply grateful. And like I say, it changed my life. And I will be getting a hold of the gut immune connection right away. I feel so honored that you took the time to answer my questions. I could, take up days and days of your life with my questions. I've accumulated a lot through the years, but I really feel like you've covered some really important points that people are going to appreciate.
Okay, well, yeah, thanks, Casey. It's really been great talking to you. Really enjoyed it. And,